Hello everyone. So today we are going to look at an example of how to solve for absolute and comparative advantage. Now let's say there are two countries, the US and Canada, and there are just two products that they produce, that each country produce, wheat and barley. Now we want to see like what technology is there for US and Canada. So let's say for US, let's say 1 ton of wheat, where W is wheat, requires, let's say, 2 hours to produce. And let's say 1 ton of barley, where B is for barley, requires 6 hours to produce. Okay? Now let's say for Canada, let's say we have 1 ton of wheat requires, let's say, 5 hours to produce, and 1 ton of barley, where B is for barley, requires 10 hours to produce. Now we want to know which country has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat and the absolute advantage in the production of barley, and we also want to know which country has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat and barley. So in this case, let's look at the US first. The US requires just 2 hours to produce 1 ton of wheat. Now if we compare it with Canada, to produce 1 ton of wheat, Canada requires 5 hours. So the US needs fewer hours to produce the same amount of wheat when compared to Canada. On the other hand, if we look at barley, the US requires the same thing, a fewer number of hours compared to Canada to produce the same ton of barley. So in this case, we can say, well, if we look at wheat, we can say that the US has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat. Canada has an absolute advantage in the production of neither wheat or barley, because the US has an absolute advantage in the production of both. So if we write it, we will write the US has an absolute advantage in the production of both wheat and barley. Now let's go back and let's see, all right, well, what happens for comparative advantage now? So first we need to calculate the opportunity cost before we go for comparative advantage. Now let's look at this for the US. If the US needs 2 hours to produce 1 ton of wheat and 6 hours in order to produce 1 ton of barley, now let's think about what will happen if the US gives up the production of 1 ton of barley. If that happens, then the US frees up 6 hours. So 1 ton of barley frees up 6 hours. So it gives me 6 extra hours of time. Now, with that 6 hours, how many tons of wheat can I produce? Well, for the US, if each ton of wheat requires 2 hours, then in 6 hours I can produce 3 tons of wheat. So instead of producing 1 ton of barley, I could produce 3 tons of wheat in the US. So, or 3 tons of wheat. If we look at Canada, if I give up 1 ton of barley in Canada, I free up 10 hours. I'll just write an H here. With that 10 hours, how many tons of wheat can I produce? I can produce, well, 1 ton of wheat requires 5 hours, so in 10 hours I can produce 2 tons of wheat. So in this case, if we go back, if we now write down the opportunity cost, so Canada's opportunity cost is 1 ton of barley or 2 ton of wheat. For the US, it is 1 ton of barley or 3 tons of wheat. Okay, now if we are comparing these, let's now think about, instead of wheat, let's consider them to be dollar amounts. So if I'm shopping for barley, it's cheaper for me to get barley from Canada, because if we think about, instead of wheat in dollar amounts, it costs $2 to buy 1 ton of barley in Canada, but it costs $3 to buy 1 ton of barley in the US. So it's cheaper for me to get barley from Canada, or Canada has to give up fewer tons of wheat to get 1 ton of barley. Our US has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. So we can write then, Canada has a comparative advantage in barley. US has a comparative advantage in wheat. Okay, and that's how we calculate absolute and comparative advantage.